should give everybody, like, these competency tests, right? The cognitive, they call it cognitive. You know, I'm the only president that went for cognitive. I think every president and vice president should be forced to take cognitive exams, mental tests, like, are they intelligent? Wouldn't it be nice? But you got to win the midterms, because if we don't win the midterms, it's just going to be, I mean, they'll find a reason to impeach me. I'll get impeached. We don't impeach them. You know why? Because they're meaner than we are. We should have impeached Joe Biden for 100 different things. We have to even run against these people. Now, I won't say cancel the election. They should cancel the election, because the fake news will say, he wants the elections canceled. He's a dictator. They always call me a dictator. Nobody's worse than Obama and the people that surrounded Biden. Not Biden. I don't think it was Biden. He didn't know what the hell was going on, okay? The election was rigged. He had no idea what happened. He still doesn't. So I could have the most unbelievable 4 years, and I guess I'm not allowed to run. I'm not sure. Is there a little something out there that I'm not allowed to run? But let's assume I was allowed to run. I could have, there's going to be a constitutional movement.
Hi, and in case you didn't know, this is Jake, and this is Politics by Jake. And what we opened with is an example of what many in my profession, and also many in the mental health profession, Bandy Lee is an example. You can go to her website, worldhealth.org. Mary Trump, his disenfranchised niece, who is a board-certified clinical psychologist, talk about as the madness. This is the destroyed speech. Notice the jumbled speech. Notice how, and this is why Wolf Blitzer, by the way, cut him off when this was played on the air, cut him off on one of his screeds because he rambles like this. He doesn't stay on topic. He goes from one thing to another. And do you notice how it's always about him? Do you notice about how he acknowledges the things that he does, the need for him to be impeached, the need for him to be stopped in this left-handed sort of way, this kind of, if you want to use a word, stochastic sort of a way. And when I say stochastic, by the way, and that's something that you have heard noised about, you may not know just exactly what it is. There's a couple of ways to think about it. Stochastic actually means, and as with many things, there are multiple definitions of it. Stochastic means governed by probability and randomness rather than by certainty or a fixed predictable sequence. In other words, a stochastic process is one where outcomes aren't fully determined in advance, but they emerge from chance, from patterns of likelihood and statistical behavior. Practical examples, for example, you say for weather is stochastic. You can say, well, there's a 70% chance of rain, not it will rain at 3:17 p.m. Financial markets are stochastic. Trends exist. Exact price movements don't. Epidemics are stochastic. Spread follows probabilities, not scripts. Political violence can be stochastic. Rhetoric raises the odds, even if no one orders a specific act. And this is why the word matters, especially in politics. When people talk about stochastic terror, when they talk about stochastic terrorism, when they talk about stochastic violence, they mean a situation where leaders or media figures don't issue direct orders, but instead they flood the environment with signals that statistically increase the likelihood that someone somewhere will act violently. No command, no plan, but a predictable rise in probability. And that's the key idea on stochastic. I hadn't intended to segue quite this long on it, but it's an important thing for you, my listeners. And I know I have new listeners. Welcome to the show, by the way. Welcome. It is a new year, 2026, and we're just going to be a year of immense import for the American people and for the world. But getting back to this, finishing this up, it's no command. It's not a command. It's not no plan, but it's a predictable rise in probability. That's the key idea. Intent can operate through probability, not instruction. And that is why Trump has been, and others like him, but Trump has been accused of stochastic violence and stochastic terrorism, because this is the way he talks. And you can say, Jake, you're talking out of both sides of your mouth here. Because once you say that he's a fool, that he has no sense, that he's mentally deranged, and then you attribute intelligence to him. Well, there's the old saying, crazy like a fox, right? Foxes seem to have an extraordinary kind of intelligence, but it's not the same thing. So you shouldn't confuse them. So getting back to what I was saying, he doesn't stay on one topic. He goes from one to another. And it's hard to follow. And do you notice how it's always about him? Do you notice how he acknowledges the things that he does? The need for him to be impeached, he acknowledges it. He may as well say, I need to be impeached. The need for him to be stopped. I need to be stopped. But he does it in this left-handed sort of way by saying things like what you hear in this, where he says, everybody calls me a dictator. People think I'm a dictator. Hint, he knows he's a dictator. It's what he wants. And this is the way he gets to say it without saying it. And he says, people say, I want to cancel the elections. Hint, big hint, he knows that he wants to cancel the elections. It's absolutely, positively his intention, as I've been saying since late 2024, early 2025. It is absolutely, positively, and people say, watch out for 2028. And I have said, no, forget 2028. Watch out for 2026. It's absolutely, positively his intention to cancel the 2026 midterms. This is the way he gets to say it without actually saying it. And where he says the other crazy things he says, this is why he does it in that way, because he's got to talk about himself. He's got to. It's got to be all about him. He has to attribute these things to himself. It's what he wants. It's what he wants to be known for. And this is how he gets to say it. And this is a characteristic of people with Trump's kind of mental disease. And let me stress, and you don't have to take my word for it, as you said, go to Bandy Lee, go to Mary Trump, who has a podcast and is talking all the time, and there are many others, my colleagues in journalism and also mental health professionals. He is mentally ill. He is not a well person. But moreover, you can hear examples of it, and this is why I did this at the beginning of the show, because we've got obviously plenty of other things to talk about. You can hear it in the rambling speech, the inability to stay on topic. This is cognitive decline. And as I said about midway through my screed, which was in response to his screed, I am Jake. This is Politics by Jake. Welcome to the show. Welcome to the listenership of Politics by Jake in 2026. And it's going to be a year full of import, a year full of event. And boy, is it really starting out this way. And at this point, I have more to say, obviously. I've got a whole show planned, very interesting stuff. We're going to talk about Ukraine, which I always want to talk about. I want to talk about Ukraine every week, but there's so many other things going on that I just feel like I want to put that on the shelf. But we're going to spend a lot of time talking about Ukraine. Hopefully in 2026, we will do that more. But at this point, having gone through about 10 minutes or so, we're going to take a break and we will be right back. And welcome again. Once again, this is Politics by Jake in 2026. And now here's a word from one of our sponsors, Twain Consulting. Hi, this is Jake with Twain Consulting. Let's be blunt, shall we? America is litigious. It's unstable, and it's financially weaponized. If your name is on everything you own, you're a sitting duck. At Twain Consulting, we help you vanish legally, ethically, and permanently. From land trusts to layered LLCs, we teach you how to restructure your assets so the predators can't see them and can't touch them. This isn't a loophole. It's a strategy that the wealthy have used for decades. Isn't it time you got the same protection? Call Twain Consulting at 805-380-5699 or visit us online. Protect what's yours before someone else claims it. And now let's get back to Jake and Politics by Jake. All right. Thank you, Twain Consulting. This is Politics by Jake in 2026, and we are back. And before I go on, having started the show, but now we're in the second segment, before I start that, I want to say I feel a little bad in a way, and I do. I talked at the end of the first segment about Ukraine and how I feel bad about that, and I want to expand on that for just a minute. I know you're hearing about other stories elsewhere. I know you're hearing about the recent ICE shooting in which an apparently award-winning, it's amazing, an award-winning poet was actually shot and killed by the ICE, as I call them, the ICE Gestapo. And they are, in fact, Gestapo. They are those psychopaths like Kyle Rittenhour who have been raised on this kind of violence and who long, like Francis of Psycho fame in the movie Stripes, all I know is I finally get to kill someone. There are many out here, and Trump, crazy like a fox, once again, not attributing intelligence to him, but a certain kind of canniness and a certain kind of sensibility, just like an animal has. There are many out there like this, and these are the people that Trump has given badges to and has given guns to, and they are venting their spleen, and they're excited about it, and they are psychopaths and sociopaths. So the ICE Gestapo shooting, the Gestapo, Venezuela, Maduro, the days breaking crises. And the reason why I'm talking about it now, but you know that ordinarily I don't spend a lot of time going into these things. And this is why. And I told you this before too, but I say it once again for my newer listeners. I know you'll get that coverage. I know that. I know that elsewhere you will hear Keith Olbermann, you will hear Rachel Maddow, you will hear various other sources. You will get that coverage. What I want to do, and what we do here for those, once again, who have recently tuned into the show or the podcast, I want to focus on something that doesn't always get explained, but which is absolutely decisive, at least I think so, in shaping everything else. So when you hear me not talk about some of these things, and actually I've been talking about some of them more in this segment than I ordinarily would, I'm not ignoring the noise. I know these things are out there, but I feel like you're getting them. What I'm doing is I'm explaining the system and the systems that produce it. So let's be blunt, okay? And explain my rationale, my raison d'etre, even more. Raison d'etre, as French means rationale. It's like Mike Myers in his comedy saying a certain je ne sais quoi, I don't know what. That's what je ne sais quoi means. It means I don't know what. But let's be blunt, okay? ICE violence is a symptom. Venezuela is a symptom. Border chaos, it's a symptom. Disinformation, it's a symptom. Rage cycles, it's a symptom. That's what a lot of these other people are covering. What I'm covering is cause. Hybrid warfare, manufactured grievance, oligarchic destabilization, psychological operations, defeatism as a strategy. That's the upstream analysis most outlets avoid because it requires attention. It breaks narratives. And the corrupt, controlled corporate media is all about things like that. It angers powerful interests. It doesn't trend well. And this is exactly why I was asked to do the show. I mean, you can ask the station owner who vetted me over a series of 9 hours, 3 separate 3-hour sessions in which I was intensely vetted for this position. And I think he thought that I was the one to fill it. And this is exactly why, therefore, Politics by Jakes exists. So with that, let's get going and let's talk about Ukraine and some of the things that I've been wanting to talk about. And I'm going to try to do better in 2026 and talk more about Ukraine. Some of these things related to that occur, that the mainstream corrupt, controlled corporate media, you're not going to hear about from them, but which I will tell you and give you my views on because I think it matters, okay? So here we go. And for those of you who, don't know about this, in brief, for context, Ukraine is fighting a war of national survival after Russia launched a full-scale invasion in February of 2022. That invasion followed years of pressure, including Russia's 2014 seizure of Crimea, the whole of Crimea, and its support for separate forces in eastern Ukraine under the facade and the guise that, and we're going to talk about this in a minute, that somehow those people needed to be rescued, that they were Russian-speaking people. Oh boy, even as I say this, I want to get into it more and I shouldn't, but it's support for separatist forces, let's just say, in eastern Ukraine, which it itself fostered and created. This is not a civil war. It's not a border dispute about people in one part of Ukraine who happen to speak Russian. Many of the Ukrainians speak Russian. It's a war of aggression. It's aimed at bringing Ukraine back under Moscow's control. As you've heard me say in earlier shows, much earlier shows, I have called Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin a revanchist. And revanchist, it's the French word revanche, like je ne sais quoi. And it just means revenge. He wants the territories that were lost back. He wants them back. That's what a revanchist is. He wants those territories back. And Ukraine is one of the ones he absolutely positively wants back. And he wants it under Moscow's control. And he wants to prevent it, which so far has just unbelievably, utterly failed, from aligning politically and economically with Europe. And since 2022, the war has settled into a grinding conflict along a long front, with Russia using mass artillery, missile strikes, drones, asymmetric warfare against both military targets, and we're going to talk about the asymmetric warfare in a minute, but against both military targets and civilian infrastructure. And Ukraine relying on Western-supplied weapons from the United States, but definitely from the European Union, intelligence and domestic mobilization to hold territory and defend its cities. And despite repeated claims that Ukraine is about to collapse, it has not. The country remains militarily viable, very militarily viable. Its government is intact. Its resistance continues with significant European support, even as U.S. policy has become more uncertain. And the war now extends beyond the battlefield. Russia is also conducting what's called hybrid, I say asymmetric, hybrid warfare, cyber attacks, sabotage, disinformation, political pressure, and intimidation across Europe, while trying to convince the Western public that resistance is futile, like the Borg on Star Trek. You will be assimilated, and that surrender would actually be the humanitarian thing to do. That's the background, okay? With that in mind, let's get up to date and talk about some of the things that are actually happening now and why those things matter. Okay, so we have this strange dynamic, and we're actually almost out of time on this, but let's get started. We have this strange dynamic that the accusation that Ukraine has somehow attempted recently the assassination of Vladimir Vladimirovich at his dacha, right? You know, his dacha, that's what the Russians call their palatial homes. His is up there in the north, in the St. Petersburg region, right? And the Valda is a series of conversations. It's a kind of a seminar that they put on every year or so, I guess, and that's apparently where he was. A big swarm of 80 or 90 Ukrainian drones coming just about straight north and out of the northern edge of Ukraine. We'd have to assume, and the purpose of this, that, they were seeking to blow him up. And all that wonderful Russian anti-aircraft defense or air defense was able to shoot down all of them, right? But now this has become the new grievance of Russia, right? Hitler had the Dolchstoß Legende, which means the double stab story. The stab in the back of 1918, when the German army was betrayed by the politicians. That's what he said. He talked about that all the time. In this case, it's somehow that it's illegitimate for Ukraine to launch attacks on the Russian commander-in-chief, even though You're in the middle of a war that the Russians started, which Putin celebrates and hypes at every chance he gets, where he has declared total war, declared that he doesn't need negotiations anymore because he's claiming that the progress of Russian military forces on the map is so overwhelming and so lightning fast that negotiations almost, well, the idea is that the events overtake it so fast. And of course, this is a lot of baloney. It's a big lie. It's a stunt. So at this point, let's take another break and we'll be back. And this is Politics by Jake. And now here's a word from one of our sponsors, Twain Consulting. Hi, this is Jake with Twain Consulting. Imagine, if you will, having the power to disappear from the prying eyes of creditors, identity thieves, nosy strangers, all while protecting what you've worked so hard to build. That's what virtual invisibility offers. It's not magic. It's smart legal and business strategy to shield your assets and privacy so you can live free, confident, and in control. Most people think that asset protection is only for the ultra-wealthy, but it's for anyone who wants peace of mind and financial security, including you. Don't wait until it's too late. Take control now. Call me at 213-465-0639 or go to facebook.com/Twain Consulting to learn how virtual invisibility can protect you and your family, because when you're invisible to risk, you're unstoppable. Now let's get back to Jake and Politics by Jake. And this is Politics by Jake, and we're back. Thank you, Twain Consulting. And we're talking about Putin. We're talking about the fact that they're trying to assassinate him because it's a war. The Ukrainians are trying to remove the leadership of Russia, and how that the portrayal is that this is just so wrong. And it's just better for Ukraine to surrender, that Ukraine itself is responsible for the loss of life because it dares to defend itself. And I ended the second segment with that this is just, it's a big lie. It's a stunt. And I'm thinking once again, and I told you I was going to talk about this, but I'm thinking again of Hitler. Not so far away, right? In Poland, right? We had this so-called, what's called in German, the Gleiwitz incident, right? Hitler wanted to attack Poland, but he needed a pretext. So it's getting to be August of 1939. Hitler wants to attack, but he wants to be seen as the victim, of course. So what happens was he gets together with, I guess, Himmler, and they go to a German penitentiary. They take some prisoners out, and they kill them. And they dress them in Polish uniform. And then they take this whole operation to a German radio station near the border. And that's Gleiwitz. And then they shoot the place up. And this is how it happened. This is what really happened. This is how the Second World War started in September of 1939. This was the provocation, and it was all made up, just like what Vladimir Vladimirovich is doing is all made up. And they even stage on the German one, I guess, one of the so-called, it's an actor, reads a text. I guess it was a Polish actor, I guess a Polish mercenary, reading the text on the radio saying, "Where are the Polish forces?" It's a bunch of dead guys from a German penitentiary that are just, the Germans purposely strewn all over the radio station after they shot it up. And this guy says, "Where are the Polish forces? We're now taking over Germany. So watch out, and we're coming for you." And they put that on the air. I mean, and then maybe that guy got out, maybe not. But there we had the whole case, and it was called Operation Canned Meat. And we have other interesting, it looks to me like that's some sort of a parallel. It's just that in this case, the inhabitants of the local town have now been quizzed and interrogated by reporters. And they say, what did you see last night? And basically, they say nothing. And therefore, this casts significant doubt, it seems to me, devastating doubt, on this claim that somehow the evil Ukrainians were trying to kill Putin. Do you see? So in other words, it was just made up. And somehow the wonderful, supreme, Acme, Russian anti-aircraft defenses shot down all 80 to just ridiculous. As I said, it's a stunt, it's a lie. And then, of course, since we do not believe in both sidesism, we just have to remember the great principle of international affairs is reciprocity. In other words, whatever you do to the other guy, he's eventually going to get around to doing to you. So we remember a number of attempts. I can't count them. I don't know if there's an official count of Russian special forces, irregular forces, attempting to assassinate Zelensky. We have a well-established case in which the Russians tried to attack the parliament building or did attack the parliament building in Kiev. This is just recently. And try to blow up the parliament, take as many of the national leaders as they could along with them. This happened in December with that attack as they could. So somehow the idea is this. If Russia bombs Ukraine, that's fine. That's not worth commenting on. This is now the media line. The corrupt, ignorant, immoral, morally insane, now we have to say, since it's been taken over increasingly by Trumpism, who have been on a complete defeatist line. And they were before, because they were walking on eggshells because of Trump. That Russia is invincible, that the Russian forces are invulnerable, and that Ukraine should surrender, and that they should stop the useless bloodletting. Resistance is in vain, like Star Trek. You will be assimilated. Resistance is futile. It's futile. So stop doing it. And with that, you get the Russians into a big huffy mood. How dare you do that to us after we've been doing it to you for 4 years? And of course, we have the paragons of virtue. We have the ruling class of India led by Modi. And Modi has said, or his government has said something about, oh, this is unacceptable. How dare you attack Putin, who's selling me my oil at cut rate prices? How dare you? They didn't seem to have done that very loudly when the Russians were launching their own attacks. Unprovoked, dastardly assault of February 22nd, 2022. We're going to be in the 4th anniversary now in just about a month. They didn't care about that. But when turnabout becomes fair play, sauce for the goose, sauce for the gander, no, not there. And indeed, the biggest hypocrites of all, the United Arab Emirates, the people who are funding a civil war in Sudan, which is certainly, I would say, if you want to look for a genocide in the world, if you're looking for an #1 Class A genocide, that's the one you should be looking at, the one in Sudan. So the UAE notoriously funds the rapid support forces, the rebels, the preeminent butchers of that front. And that's no good. And then we have even now the UAE interfering in Yemen, right? In Yemen, you have a civil war. The first idea is the Houthi rebels in the north, supported by Iran and the rest of the government in the south. That includes the city of Aden, which was fought over by the British and the others in the 50s and the 60s. So that's the first thing. It's the northern Houthis against the southern. And what can we say? Less militant, more normal parts of it, although not that much. And now the attempt by the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, is to split that in two. In other words, a couple of boatloads of weapons showing up in the harbor there, Aden, I think, in southern Sudan. And Yemen and the Saudi government, Saudi Arabian government, has gone nuts over the past couple of days saying you're not allowed to do that. And the UAE got scared, given the size of Saudi Arabia. They have apparently said they're not going to do that. They're going to drop that. They're going to stop their military operation in Yemen, where they had no business to be in the first place. Okay? So what we're waiting for now is essentially a clarification of a number of these military situations, and I will tell you a couple of them. The U.S., meretricious, mercenary, venal media, right? Mass media. Do you ever get the impression at Politics by Jake that I don't like the mass media? No. Where would you get that idea? Okay, very good. And I say this, by the way, whether they be commercial, whether they be corporate or public, so-called public. They're really not public. They're oligarchical. It's this isn't even new. This goes back to Nelson Rockefeller way back when in the 50s. But the claim from them is that their analysis, we might say, is that Russia, of course, is invincible, that the Russian military forces are unstoppable, that resistance is futile, the Borg, and ought to end. and that Ukraine ought to be assimilated, and that the only humanitarian stance is to call for appeasement, total surrender, total capitulation, and that's the way to save lives. And of course, whatever happens later when the modern KGB guys get into a place like Ukraine, if they ever do that, God forbid, then we'll see. Maybe that's the idea that you can end the bloodshed with that, which is a fallacy. It's absurd. So part of this now is, if you're in Europe, you're acutely aware now that there's a continuous bombardment of asymmetric, or what I call asymmetric, they call hybrid warfare. And that's okay. We can call it hybrid. Measures that are being launched by Russia against Europe. And when I say asymmetric, when I say hybrid, this is the Gerasimov doctrine. And at this point, let's take another break under the message from Twain Consulting. This is Politics by Jake, and we will be right back. And now here's a word from one of our sponsors, Twain Consulting. Hi, this is Jake with Twain Consulting. Let's be blunt, shall we? America is litigious. It's unstable, and it's financially weaponized. If your name is on everything you own, you're a sitting duck. At Twain Consulting, we help you vanish legally, ethically, and permanently. From land trusts to layered LLCs, we teach you how to restructure your assets so the predators can't see them and can't touch them. This isn't a loophole. It's a strategy that the wealthy have used for decades. Isn't it time you got the same protection? Call Twain Consulting at 805-380-5699 or visit us online. Protect what's yours before someone else claims it. And now let's get back to Jake and Politics by Jake. And thank you, Twain Consulting. This is Politics by Jake, and we're back. So at the end of this segment, that just previously happened before the commercial, I brought up the idea of the Gerasimov doctrine. Once again, those of you newer listeners may not have heard of this. You may not know what it is. So let me just tell you. The Gerasimov doctrine is a concept named after Russia's top general, Valery Gerasimov. And it's basically the idea that modern conflicts aren't just fought with tanks and missiles, with a blend of military, political, economic, cyber, and informational tactics. In other words, it's about using a whole toolkit of implements to destabilize and influence an adversary before you even get to open warfare. So when people talk about this, they're basically and when I talk about it, and I'm going to talk about it here in just a second. We're getting right into it. I'm talking about this idea of hybrid or asymmetric warfare, which is not guns and bullets, which is not armies in trenches or charging each other with rifles and bayonets. You see? It's hybrid. It's asymmetric. It's not that, but it's something different. It's the mix of propaganda, of cyber attacks, of political manipulation, conventional force, to achieve strategic goals. It's not a single official doctrine that Russia formally rolled out, but it's more of a shorthand for how modern Russian strategy blends all these elements together, okay? All right. And as I said, if you're in Europe, you're acutely aware that there's a continuous bombardment of hybrid or asymmetric warfare measures that are being launched by Russia against Europe. Russia is at war with you. Russia and its concept of Duginism, with its concept of Eurasianism, with its concept of Russia, Moscow as the third Rome, is at war with you. And the most obvious and dramatic is the constant presence of drones. Even in Britain, even in France, near Brest, at the nuclear submarine base there, which is the base of the French nuclear deterrent. The force, but also in Britain and elsewhere. But we've had drones over Poland, over Romania, over Denmark, over Norway, over Belgium, over the Netherlands, just about all of Northern Europe. That is Northern European plain, which is where the Russians would eventually like to be launching their divisions, because this is what Stalin wanted to do. He wanted to go to Paris. Lenin wanted to go to Paris. And this is exactly what Putin wants to do. Nothing has changed. The more things change, the more they remain the same. And this is most certainly the case. And as I said, this is revanchism. This is revenge. He wants the land back. It's a different concept. Eurasianism is the idea of Russia as a continental empire from sea to sea. And there's the Pacific Ocean, obviously, that they're on, but they also want to be in the Atlantic. That's the idea of it. And I could, go into that, and I did on other shows, but that's basically it. And this was the old Warsaw Pact strategy. Was you get a striking force of 80 to 100,000 troops, and you punch right through. You get to the Rhine, and you get to Paris. This is where he wants to go. And then some of them said, no, keep going all the way to Madrid. Or some of them said, no, you got to get across to London. And that's not so easy. And that's where it's all been. So it's been a lot of drones. And some of the drones have been launched off ships. They're often ships of the shadow fleet. The oil tankers in particular, a couple of other places have been hit in different ways. Estonia, right? Way out there, close to St. Petersburg, Leningrad, Gulf of Finland. Their airspace was violated, as we've mentioned, by a couple of Sukhois or MiGs. Those are, Russian warplanes. We've also got the attempt to use controlled, piloted streams of desperate refugees to try to overwhelm places, the borders of places like Poland and to some extent, I think, also of Romania. You've got all kinds of threats in the air. Of course, you've got all kinds of cyber attacks that are happening. And recently we had one in the Channel Tunnel, the Eurotar Express from London to Paris. And this tunnel was shut down for at least 24 hours because of that. And let me also remind you, this is what this program is being broadcast a few days after this, but there was no power in the tunnel. And hundreds, thousands of people were waiting at St. Pancras Station in London. So the Russians have been tampering everywhere. You're not hearing this on the corrupt, controlled corporate media. You're hearing it from people like me and my colleagues at Politics by Jake. And in 2026, I'm going to try to. Ordinarily, I just do, commentary myself, and I it's not unheard of that I put a colleague on the air, but I will be putting colleagues on the air because this is going to be a year of import. This is going to be a year of events. And I want you to hear from my other colleagues. You're not going to hear it on the corporate controlled media. You will never hear me put something on the air from them, but you will hear it from these others. So, and the Russians have been tampering everywhere, and you really wonder, isn't that a pretty obvious one? I can't resist mentioning, remember that munitions plant in Tennessee? Is it 6 months ago now? Something like that, where the entire ammunition plant, which was producing for NATO Europe, blew up, killed 15 or so people. Have we ever heard another word from that on the controlled media? Wouldn't you imagine that there's an executive order from the Oval Office which now controls, to a greater extent than even before, the corporate controlled corrupt media, saying, we don't want anyone to hear any more about this. You're going to come up with nothing and you're going to shut up. And that's the end of it. And that would be my guess. Of course, it's purely a guess, pure speculation on my part, but where's the report of what happened? And you can extend that to things like attempts to blow up key parts of the Polish railroads a couple of months ago. Or indeed, go back a year and a half now, back to the Paris Olympics. And on the opening morning of that, severe disturbances in the French railway system through various kinds of sabotage that had gone on. So you've got sabotage. You've got kinds of, you might say, low-level terrorism, but maybe not so low either. So this is now the reality of Europe. Europe, you're under attack. And, the news media, certainly Barry Weiss, doesn't want to cover that on CBS. And ABC, still smarting from their haircut that they took in those lawsuits, they're not going to report it. And you'd think that somebody like National Public Radio or Public Television would cover it. But they're so focused on Gaza that the rest of the world hardly exists, even though, really, and I'll say it in my opinion, Politics by Jake, in the greater scheme of things, the fate of the world is being decided in the Russian-Ukrainian theater, not in Gaza, not in the Gaza theater at all, and not in some of the other ones that these people seem to think. So if you try to do a news broadcast or an analysis broadcast and you don't reflect the fact that the most important primary theater of operation in the world is now Eastern Europe, Russia versus Ukraine, that's a form of lying, because you're giving the people a false impression. Remember, a lie is defined as the intent to deceive. And that's what we see in all too many of these news broadcasts. So, we would like to focus, right? You have the Eurocentric view. You do, you have to. Because, look, that's the way the cookie crumbles. That's where the decisive conflict is emerging. It may be eclipsed. God knows. We just had the news now that comes from the People's Liberation Army Navy, the People's Liberation Forces of the Communist Chinese. You remember those guys? Remember them from Tiananmen Square? And that massacre, which nobody else has heard about and has been completely covered up, where the Chinese killed thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of their own people for standing up to the tanks. Remember that? That's what that was. Yeah, those people. They are now ringing the island of Taiwan, Formosa. Taiwan is being ringed around by live fire exercises. That is, warships, airplanes, missiles that are actually exploding. These are not dummy ordnance. These are actual explosions. And when they're inquired of by this, they're saying, hey, we have the right to do this. And they openly say, this is a drill that prepares us to storm, attack, invade Taiwan, and conquer it for national unification and so forth. And even though they're very hard put to say any time in the last 400 years or so, when Taiwan was an integral part of whatever dynasty was ruling in Beijing, and my personal answer here is, of course, if you want to maintain maritime communications with an island under conditions of war or near war, we already have some idea of how to do that. In World War I and World War II, the Canadians and the U.S. jointly created a system. And this is especially in World War II, by the way, of convoys that would provide them with escorts, with destroyers, with frigates, with corvettes, with anti-submarine aircraft, and so forth. And that's how Britain survived. And at this point, let's take another break. We'll be right back, and this is Politics by Jake. And now here's a word from one of our sponsors, Doctrine Consulting. Hi, this is Jake with Doctrine Consulting. Imagine, if you will, having the power to disappear from the prying eyes of creditors, identity thieves, nosy strangers, all while protecting what you've worked so hard to build. That's what virtual invisibility offers. It's not magic. It's smart legal and business strategy to shield your assets and privacy so you can live free, confident, and in control. Most people think that asset protection is only for the ultra-wealthy, but it's for anyone who wants peace of mind and financial security, including you. Don't wait until it's too late. Take control now. Call me at 213-465-0639 or go to facebook.com/Twain Consulting to learn how virtual invisibility can protect you and your family, because when you're invisible to risk, you're unstoppable. Now let's get back to Jake and Politics by Jake. And this is Politics by Jake, and we're back, and we're talking about the situation now in Taiwan, the island of Formosa, and talking about how you can break the stranglehold of the mainland communist Chinese, who are literally surrounding that island nation and saying that, we're going to practice. We're doing live fire exercises. You're surrounded. And we're going to fire off explosions and practice tactics because we're going to invade you. And how that the Canadians and the United States created a system of convoys that got supplies through to Taiwan. And that's how Britain survived. So what we would need right now is a stirring declaration. You're not going to get it. On freedom of the seas, great U.S. principle going way back, freedom of navigation, key right in the law of the sea, and so on. And that the U.S. is going to be setting up armed convoys, that is, convoys escorted by warships, to go into, let's say, the port of Kaohsiung. That's the big one, the biggest Taiwanese port. The sort of the southern end of the island, that's Kaohsiung. It's a huge operation. That's this export machine that the Taiwanese have, and that's what you would want to do. And of course, do we expect Benedict Donald to do that? I guess we don't, but we've got to raise the demand, and again, why not? Will you do it? And if not, why not? And how long do you think you can be president at this rate if you're going to be appeasing the two main adversaries, the mainland Chinese, Xi, the Emperor Xi, president for life, the two main components of oligarchical, totalitarian, neo-fascist bloc, Moscow and Beijing? And of course, don't forget Iran, right? Iran's thought now to be busily rebuilding their ballistic missile forces. This came up at the Trump and Bibi summit, and also it's not proven, but the accusations are flying that they're attempting to recreate their strategic nuclear attack force. So that's essentially it. You throw in North Korea, the DPRK, the so-called Democratic Republic of North Korea, and it gives you, or I'm sorry, of Korea, they don't acknowledge the South, and that gives you the four-power bloc, the totalitarian aggressor bloc, the anti-civilization forces. And that's what you've got to deal with in this year, which I have declared as Politics by Jake 2026, a year of events, a year of great import. That's what we've got to deal with in 2026. And it does not help to have this cowardly so-called leadership. The power of the state, deserved by somebody whose main purpose in life is aggrandizement, be it personal glory, psychological satisfactions, money, corruption. That simply will not work. So convoys. Now in Europe, on the ground, let's remember, Poland is building a new version of the old Maginot Line. Yeah, really. You're not hearing of that on the news, are you? They're doing it, maybe not in all the details, but brought up to date, certainly. And the idea being to interdict a Russian surprise attack with armored spearhead across the Polish border, which the only thing you can do with that is fortify and repel. And the Baltic states, I think all three of them, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, are now in the process of exiting the Ottawa Convention, which contained a ban on landmines, and I think specifically on anti-personnel landmines. Well, that kind of thinking was a luxury of a period of relative relaxation of tensions, right? Relative détente, if you want, reaching from the 90s to maybe 2010 or so, which is when things began to heat up. Maybe the Georgia War of 2008 would be the turning point. But now you've got to have you have now defensive works. And that would be, for example, the Baltic states are on the verge of closing all border crossings. That is an absolute closure that I'm talking about of border crossings from Russia into Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. Finland looks at its own long border and is taking, I think, similar measures. And we're all, the eyes of the world are on this Suwalki corridor between Belarus, which of course is a complete satellite. It's a complete protectorate of Russia on the one hand, and the Kaliningrad enclave on the other, facing the Baltic, sort of sandwiched there, sandwiched in there by Poland. What the Russians are going to want to do, if it comes to the shooting part, they're going to try to interdict that Suwalki corridor by cutting it off. And that's your main land route from Poland into Lithuania, and hence into Latvia and Estonia, and it's got to be defended. Should be fortified at this point. I hope Poland does it. And it looks like you've got the Baltic states building fences, building all kinds of preliminary barriers across their borders. So here we are with this kind of climate where, if the trains break down the Channel Tunnel, I haven't heard it, but I don't need to hear it. I can figure it out for myself. The prime suspect is the dictator sitting in Moscow. And all the more because we've got this campaign by the Russians that the real warmongers are the Europeans. It's not me. Not me, little Vladimir Vladimirovich. I'm a good guy. It's those darn Europeans of the European Union. You heard Trump talking about it. We don't impeach people. Why, he said? Because they're meaner than we are. Don't you believe it? The Russians are the real warmongers, not the European Union, not European NATO. And they're saying that it is European Union, European NATO, that those are the ones who are preventing a peaceful solution. When Putin says peaceful solution, like Hitler, he's going to say, well, that means surrender to all my demands. And of course, they don't do that. And the reason the Ukrainians can stand up for a considerable span into the future, I would say, is the $105 to $110 billion pledged by the European Union a couple of weeks ago, with significant parts of that money already arriving, which can be used to provide the Soviet Union a couple of weeks ago with significant parts of the Soviet Union, which can be, used to provide the sinews of war, the Patriot anti-aircraft missiles, the anti-ballistic missiles. All of those can be provided. So in terms of physical ability to sustain the fight, I think Ukraine is pretty much okay for 2026. Now, it would have been better to get the $210 billion in the form of Russian assets held in Belgium, but a kind of Trump clone prime minister there, right-wing, bankrupt character, didn't want to do it. He had excuses, but the Europeans somehow kept going. And what we're hoping for now is this year ought to be the year of Germany, when the merged government of Germany really moves in and shows that tremendous productive capacity, that tremendous economic muscle of the German Federal Republic, which is going to be key to maintaining the free world position in Central and Eastern Europe. It's going to be absolutely critical, but let's take a look. We're operating here in the aftermath of the Mar-a-Lago Summit Conference. There was a meeting of 2 to 3 hours. There was a press conference. And the thing that has been noted by many observers is the Zelensky-Trump meeting took place in an atmosphere of superficial cooperation, good feelings, bonhomie, but of course, nothing concrete, no specific process beyond what had been attained by the U.S.-Ukrainian working groups, which had been essentially going since about the 20th of November. 20th November, as you call, is when this document of infamy came out, the crude English translation of a Russian language original, essentially Putin's war program maximum, his wish list, his dream solution of everything that he wanted, which this stupid Witkov, Witless, or Whitwood, was attempting to pass off as a U.S. government document with the help of the boy wonder Jared Kushner. And that, of course, is the big shock, right? That Trump was seeking to sell out Ukraine to the Russians. And it got the attention of Europe. They were healthy enough to see that this was an existential threat and to see where it was actually coming from. So that had been going on. But now you have to ask yourself, Zelensky shows himself to be flexible. Some would say too flexible. I think he's essentially attempting to negotiate, but in the sense of going through a difficult phase, because Zelensky has got a couple of corruption scandals at home, and naturally you would really wonder what petty bourgeois twerp of the good government, clean government type would choose now, when the very existence of the country is at stake, to unleash this stuff and make a big issue. And it's notable that there's no country in the world so backward that it's not vulnerable to corruption scandals. I mean, give me a break. Because it's kind of the human condition. It's sort of the law. It's sort of the darkness of the human ego. It's not going to be easy to get rid of. All right, so what does this mean? It means that 2026, the year of great events, like I said, year of great import, like I said, has to be, for us here in the United States, the year of great activism. One of the interesting things is the media was saying the clock is ticking for Ukraine. And I would say, look, the clock is ticking even faster for Russia. In other words, the demographic collapse, the economic collapse, which I should really do a show about at end of time now. I'm not going to do it now. Currency collapse, budget collapse, all of that is ongoing. And this is why we have this phase now where Putin feels that the Trump regime is the answer to his prayers, the answer to all his KGB prayers. And he thinks that this can become the key, perhaps like Hitler felt when he had heard that Roosevelt had died. But he realizes, I think he's well informed, that Trump, well, he could be impeached. I mean, Putin is well informed. He could be impeached and paralyzed from one minute to the next. All it takes, a few more special elections, shift to 15% or more of the votes. So remember, as soon as you get control of the House of Representatives, you can impeach, and you better have it already. And not just for Trump, but also for his ilk, also for his cabal, also for people like Noam and Witless Witkoff and Levitt and Bondi and RFK. And that's our show. And we'll see you the next time. And this is Politics by Jake.